كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان.
فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة فإذا عن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series Reflections on the Quran. In our previous episode we talked about Quranic stories, and in passing we talked about the fact that the story of Musa alayhi salam, it's repeated very frequently in the Quran. And we talked about some who looked at that in this symbolic way that Fir'awn in particular represents the human ego at its worst. Now, there are other considerations that we can also bring to bear on that story. It's obviously an important story because if we look and see the human being whose name is mentioned most frequently in the Quran is Musa alayhi salam. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is only mentioned a couple of times, and various of the other prophets are mentioned also, but nowhere near the number that Musa is mentioned. He's mentioned more than 120 times by name. And the number 2 human being that's mentioned most often in the Quran is not another prophet, it's Fir'awn. He's mentioned roughly 60 times, so about half the number of times as Musa. So, why are they mentioned so frequently? One consideration that I think is relevant is that we know that in contrast to certain stories, that the story of Musa and Fir'aun is well grounded in a time and a place. And it's that Pharaonic era of Egypt. Now, Egypt and Mesopotamia are considered the cradles of human civilization. And they were the first complex societies in human history. And since then, the majority of people have lived in complex societies, and in the modern world, virtually everyone is part of a complex society. Now, what's the difference between that and what happened before? What's a non-complex society? In a non-complex society, in early human history, people were just living in these small groups, and everybody in the group was related to each other, and everybody was basically on the same level. There weren't rich and poor. People shared things with each other, and leadership was based on respect. A man, to be a leader, had to earn the respect of the other people in the group. And leaders didn't just say, okay, you do this and you do that. Decision-making occurred through consensus. People, everybody who was recognized as having a voice, which normally would be the adults, sometimes the adult men, maybe also women, that they would have some kind of input into what to do about some situation that had arisen. What you see in complex society is something quite different. They arose normally when a tribe conquered its neighbors. And so they would enslave some of them, and those that they allowed to stay on their land, they would impose tax upon them. And normally, in the old days, they would pay it in the form of grain. And what you saw in these complex societies is that they controlled some geographical area that had defined boundaries. And there was hierarchical social structure. There was a ruling class, and there was a peasant class, and normally there was a couple of classes in between. There was a priestly class in the ancient world, and some kind of a bureaucracy. And there was a distribution of wealth. These upper classes were wealthier than the lower classes. And also what you start to see in these societies is the development of cities, and then you have economic specialization. There would be some people that just made things out of wood, some people who just made things out of iron, some people who just wove cloth. So there's all these specific occupations that start to develop in these complex societies. And we see all of that pretty much in modern societies up until this day. So Fir'awn is an example of a ruler of one of the first societies of that type. And he's a really bad ruler. He's an example of what goes wrong in those situations. Now, some other aspects, Joseph Tainter, he wrote what I think is an amazing book called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And so before going into the collapse of certain complex societies in history, he defines what is a complex society. And so in addition to what we were talking about already, one of the things he mentions is that these centralized governments in complex societies, they monopolize force and decision-making. So before, when we talked about these simple tribal village kind of societies, there was just people getting together and deciding, and everybody was involved in that process. No, in these complex societies, there's a small group of people who make decisions for everyone else. And that small group of people also, they control armies and police. And in many countries, nobody else is allowed to carry a weapon except those people. And they can mobilize their populations for work and for war. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, they collect taxes. And another major thing they do is they make laws and they enforce them. Now, one of the problems that arises when you have this kind of a civilization is that you have a leader of the society, and he's not related to most people by blood. So when people are related to each other by blood, then there's a kind of a built-in nature, human nature of loyalty towards your kin. If you're the ruler, you only have a few people that you're actually related to in the society. And so how do you make everybody else loyal to you? So the issue of legitimacy in a government, one of the ways to do that in the ancient world was to make some kind of link between the ruler and the supernatural. And so for a long time, what that meant was that the ruler, there would be a priestly class that does all the rituals that the people believed are necessary in order to please the gods. Usually they were mushrik cultures. Please the gods, and by pleasing the gods, then that would keep the world going smoothly. So these priests were expert in those rituals, and they usually got into this idea that, you know, you had to do these rituals right down to the last detail. They would come up with these really complicated details that have to be fulfilled in order for these rituals to be valid. And the priests were there to make the society run smoothly. And they were supposed to be able to tell the people what the gods thought. And so one of the things that the priests would do in these kind of societies was to tell the people that, hey, you know, this king was chosen by the gods, and therefore everybody should obey him. And so when that is the attitude, then the king can rule smoothly. But if material life doesn't run smoothly, things start to go wrong, then there's a loss of faith in the leader that maybe these bad things are happening because the gods no longer love the king. So when material life started to develop problems, there was this concept that the king has lost the mandate of heaven. And if things got bad enough, then he would either be challenged by somebody from within that country, or he would be invaded from outside and conquered. A more extreme solution to the problem of the legitimacy of the ruler is to actually say that, hey, this ruler is a god. And for a long time, like in Mesopotamia, there was no sign of that. And the way that so this kind of idea creeping into history, well, we're going to take a break now. We'll pick this up after the break.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن أم على قلوب أقفالها.
Soothing verses, awakening contents.
Unlock your hearts. Let us start to reflect and interact with the glorious Quran through simple and interactive grammar exercises.
هو هم أنت أنتم أنا نحن.
Explore the secrets of success that exist in the blessed lines of the Holy Quran.
Using what you recite every day and night, learn 250 words that occur 55,000 times, or 70% words of the Quran. Let's understand the Quran.
Let's join Dr. Abdul Aziz Abdul Rahim in Let's Understand the Quran every Saturday at 5:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 4 a.m. India on Peace TV.
Pearls of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Narrated Abu Huraira, may Allah be pleased with him. I heard Allah's messenger, may peace be upon him, saying regarding Ramadan, whoever performed Salah at night in it with sincere faith and hoping for a reward from Allah, then all his past sins will be forgiven. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 3, Book of Night Prayers, Hadith number 2008.
I wanted to share with you some of the ayat of the Quran and some of the ahadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Care and affection, guidance and encouragement, dedication and vision,
which give us an indication and an instruction,
uplifting the horizons of the child in an Islamically sound way.
as to how to be good Muslim parents.
Muhammad Tim Humble.
Welcome to a brand new series, 26 ways to be a good Muslim parent.
Imbibe the various qualities of ideal parents essential for their children's upbringing and betterment from 26 ways to be a good Muslim parent. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. So we're talking about the first instance in history where some king made a claim of divinity. Fir'aun wasn't the first. According to archaeologists, they found, in looking at the history of Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq, they would depict their kings wearing a certain kind of like headdress. And because they depicted their gods to look like people, they had a different kind of a headdress that they would put on the gods. And at some point in history, there was some king whose name is now forgotten, except to some ultra expert on that period in history. There was some king who started showing pictures of himself on those, carvings and paintings in temples and tombs. He had a picture of himself wearing the kind of a headdress that only gods are supposed to wear. And so you had this phenomenon in the ancient world of some kings claiming to be divine. And so Fir'aun, of course, is the one who's gone down in history. Everybody knows him. He said, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la." I am your Lord, the Most High. And he told Musa, if you take any other deity beside me, I'm going to put you in jail. That was another tool that was used in order to make people who were down at the bottom of the society accept the way the system was and accept the ruler as being legitimate. And it would be madness, and not just madness, I mean, it would be damning your soul to rebel against somebody who was a god on earth. The story of Fir'aun, one of the things that it highlights is what's called the agency problem. That's usually mentioned in terms of business. If you appoint someone to be your agent, like, for instance, the board of directors of a corporation are the agents of all the people who own stock in the company. They're supposed to represent the interests of their stockholders, but they're individual people, so they also have their own interests. And so the agency problem is that somebody who has been appointed to look out for the interests of another person, there's a kind of a tension there where he can sometimes damage the interests of those whom he represents in order to further his own interests. And so kings fulfill two roles. On one level, they're supposed to be looking out for their people. On another level, they're individual human beings. And because of their position, then they have many special privileges that normal people don't have. So according to Marxists, the essential nature of rulers is that they're oppressors. They looked at kings down through history and they said, what these people were doing was expropriating the wealth of others in order to live luxurious lives. And so the task of history, according to Marxists, was to overthrow anybody that was on some higher level and let the people at the bottom rule. Of course, not everybody can rule at once. So at the end of the day, there always has to be some small group that makes decisions for everyone else. The scholars of sociology, they identified Marxism as one subgroup of a general school of thought that looks at the role of rulers in history as conflict-based. And interestingly, some of them identify Ibn Khaldun as the prominent exemplar of the conflict school of thought as far as the role of rulers in history. I mean, Ibn Khaldun was by no means a Marxist. His ideas are very, very different from Marx. But there was a certain kind of similarity in the sense that he saw cultures as going through these cycles where you have somebody who conquers and then their rule goes through a flowering period, consolidation of power, expansion of power, and then a decline, and then a fall where they're replaced by some other ruler by a process of conflict. So that's the angle by which that highlighting of conflict in the issue of ruling gave a name to a school of thought. There's another school of thought that looks at rulers, they're called integrationists. They look at rulers as, yeah, they do those things. They take other people's wealth and live high and mighty, but they do all these other things in the society. They collect the surplus of the farmers. The farmers grow the dawn of civilization. They were able to start growing more than they actually needed to eat in order to survive and have children and pass on their genes to the next generation. And so what kings did was they took this surplus and they built cities and they patronized craftsmen and all these other kinds of professions. So they helped develop their civilizations economically. They also employed people who knew how to write, scribes, in their bureaucracy. They had to keep records in order to run things properly. And so they contributed to the rise of the human skill of writing and therefore the accumulation of human knowledge. And they would also do things like build roads. And so wherever they conquered, that area would become more integrated. Economically, there would be a flourishing of trade within their borders. Frequently, there would also be trade outside their lands. So they stimulated the world's economy. So these are all like positive features of what goes on in a state. Now, if we look at the Quran and what it has to say about the role of rulers, it highlights Fir'aun as a bad ruler, and it also mentions Nimrud, although not by name, as an example of this person who's become entirely deluded because of his position of wealth and power. And we have this kind of a statement from Bilqis, the queen of Sheba. She says, إِنَّ الْمُلُوكَ إِذَا دَخَلُوا قَرْيَةً أَفْسَدُوهَا وَجَعَلُوا أَعِزَّةَ أَهْلِهَا أَذِلَّةً. Whenever kings go into a city, they ruin it and humiliate its leaders. On the other hand, you have the Quran's articulation of what Allah expects from a ruler. He addresses Dawood, saying, Ya Dawood, إِنَّا جَعَلْنَاكَ خَلِيفَةً فِي الْأَرْضِ فَاحْكُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِالْحَقِّ وَلَا تَتَّبِعِ الْهَوَى فَيُضِلَّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَضِلُّونَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ شَدِيدٌ بِمَا نَسُوا يَوْمَ الْحِسَابِ. Dawood, we have given you mastery over the land, so judge fairly between people, and do not follow your desires, lest they divert you from the way of Allah. Those who wander from His path will have a painful torment because they ignore the day of reckoning. So, a person who wants to hold on to power at any cost will do all kinds of terrible things because he has become diverted from the function that Allah wants from him. And you have to sort of put blinkers on and just ignore the consequences of your actions in the hereafter in order to do a lot of the things that rulers do in order to stay in power. And so Allah is telling Dawood, don't do that. Yes, it's true. Rulers, it's legitimate for rulers sometimes to kill people. But there are legitimate cases of that, and there are illegitimate cases of that. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, as we mentioned in an earlier episode when we were talking about Islamic legal maxims, he stressed that a ruler must base his policies to secure the welfare of his people. Famous hadith of Bukhari and Muslim, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. Every one of you is a shepherd, and every one of you will be asked about his flock. Al-imamu ra'in wa mas'ulun an ra'iyyatih. The ruler is a shepherd, and he will be asked about his flock, meaning his people. And in another hadith that was narrated, I believe, by Imam Ahmad, the Prophet ﷺ warned that if anyone is in a position of authority over even 10 people, when he's presented before Allah on the Day of Judgment, he'll be in shackles. There'll be chains on his wrists and around his ankles. And he will have to give account, in particular, in addition to the account that everybody else has to give. That kind of person in that position will have to give account of how he dealt with the people that he was in some position of authority over. And if he was just, then he'll be released. And if he was unjust, then he'll go to hell for that. And based upon all of the textual evidence on this subject, the Muslim jurists, they came up with this qaida fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxim, that says, تَصَرُّفُ الْإِمَامِ عَلَى الرَّعِيَّةِ مَنُوطٌ بِالْمَصْلَحَةِ. The acts of the ruler that affect the public must be based on their interest. Now, one of the things we were talking about in the previous episode, talking about the nature of the stories in the Quran, is they don't tend to be very detailed, and the characters that appear in them are, you could almost say, like cardboard cutout characters in some way. With regard to the story of Fir'aun, though, we see a certain detailing of the system that he relied upon in order for his will to be exerted over his land. And so the first of these elements of the Fir'aunic society that we see are his mala, his nobility. So those are the upper class, and he consults them in how to deal with Musa. I mean, that's how we see it in the Quran. And of course, in any state, the ruler would consult his nobles regarding policy. So the first group was his nobility. The second group, of course, is the army. They are given orders and they carry them out. And so that's what we were talking about earlier. We said that the nature of these complex societies is that the centralized government monopolizes force. And the third party that we see identified actually by name in the Quran is the prime minister, the chief minister, the wazir, Haman. And then we also see Qarun. You know, he's a person who's mentioned as being from the people of Musa, but he oppressed them, and he is also there in Fir'aun's inner circle, and he's fabulously wealthy. And then the final group that we see as being a key component of Fir'aun's attempt to maintain legitimacy and maintain control was the magicians. And so we're not going to have time to look at what the Quran says about each of these groups in the remaining time, but let's start. One of the key elements of the Fir'aunic system was that he disrespected his people. In Surah Zukhruf it states, فَاسْتَخَفَّ قَوْمَهُ فَأَطَاعُوهُ. He treated his people like idiots, so they obeyed him. Come to the end of this episode, inshallah we'll take it up in the next. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wallahu a'lam.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن اصدح بصوتك اسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان من فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة فإذا وعى القرآن حين لانا كم من فؤاد كالحجارة قسوة